Welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Snowden Deli. I'm Aaron Rand from CJD along with Bill Brownstein of the Montreal Gazette. And our guest today, Arnold Bennett of the Housing Hotline, director of the Housing Hotline, because, housing is very much a topic these days. Arnold, thank you so much for being here.
Nice to be here.
Arnold, you've only been doing this for how long?
The hotline since about 1981, and tenant work. I think my first case was 74. First article was 69.
Wow. Okay. We have a chance from time to time to talk. We want to talk specifically today about the announcement by the Housing Tribunal here in Quebec that it's okay or would be accepted to have a 5.9% increase in rent. I know when I spoke to you on the radio, you said this has been the biggest rent increase approved by the rental board in how many years?
Since the 80s.
Since the 80s. All right, so let's deal with this because a lot of people don't understand how this happened. You're one of them. Explain your reaction to this.
Well, it's ridiculous because the inflation rate has actually gone down according to the tribunal's own figures. Even some of their own indicators are clearly down. For example, last year what they allowed for per thousand for major repairs was $4 a thousand, which was very high, highest it had been in years. It usually had been in the mid $2. Okay, now it's lower than that. It went down to $3.92, which is still high, but that went down. Oil is negative, gas is negative, electricity is only 2.5% for the index on those bills. So when you take a look at the impact, that's 5.9% you're talking about, weirdly, is for buildings where the tenant pays for the heating. If the landlord pays for the heating, you got 5.5 for electricity, 5 for gas, 4.1 for oil, because the negatives are the lower increase are offset against that the big increase. What's the big increase from? Purely from indexing of net profit of the landlord. That was always historically, except in the 1980s, very low in Quebec. It was for many years about 1.4%. Landlord lobby was screaming that it was too low, but last year they raised that to 4%, which was high, and this year 6.9, which is then offset to bring it down to those other rates that I mentioned. And by the way, we're not talking averages, we're not talking maximum, we're talking rock bottom minimum increase that the landlord will get if he goes to the board for those different categories, plus taxes if there's a tax increase, plus insurance if there's an insurance increase, plus whatever major repairs the landlord did according to the board's formula. So you could end up with substantially higher than 5.9% on a self-heated building. It's really, really bad. In the middle of a housing crisis, where there's a shortage, where people mostly do not have the option to move. If they do move, the rent's going to be a lot higher because there's a lot of gouging going on the market, totally disregarding any rates the government sets. And a crisis that doesn't only affect the poor anymore, it affects all the way into the middle class, people who are making decent money at their jobs, and they're senior citizens with acceptable pensions. They're all getting hammered.
And as you point out, Arnold, basically this is for people with existing leases that they could do that. If you're coming fresh into a place, they can charge whatever they can get away with, like in terms of
not legally, but and here's the but. In Ontario, they have a registry of rents, so a new tenant can check what the previous tenant was paying. Here, there's no such thing, although the City of Montreal has tried to establish something and been pushing Quebec. Still hasn't happened. So the recourse is that if the previous rent is not marked on the lease, you got 2 months from the beginning of the lease to go to the tribunal. If it is marked on the lease and you find it too high, you got 10 days from signing the lease to go to the tribunal. And there's all kinds of tricks and gimmicks that prevent people from doing that. Or let's say they suspect it's too high. In order to prove it, unless they're lucky enough to get a hold of the previous tenant's lease or manage to check rental board a tribunal decision that's online, In most cases, that information is not available unless they go on spec, file at the tribunal, and then subpoena the landlord's rental records.
Right.
Bit complicated for most people.
And
to
with
do.
a shortage of like housing available, a lot of people are just grabbing what they can because the market is such.
Yeah, but let's make the distinction. You know, this problem about jacking up the rent on new tenants has always been there. But in the past, you heard about people getting hit 50. It was considered a big deal if they were hit with $100 increase. Nowadays, you're going out there and you're finding that it's 200 or 300 or 500. It's insane.
With respect to the registry, you would know, I know we don't have an official rental registry, the provincial government has instituted. Is there some way as a tenant, there's a private registry that you can look up of any kind?
It's not going to do you any good because you need it for the unit that affects you. If you're lucky, you can find, some of the tenant organizations may be keeping records, and the city was supposed to start something. But the bottom line is, you can either go onto the jugement.qc.ca website, which basically has every single judgment rendered in the province of Quebec for going back years, and you can Google your address, or Google look up your address, look up your landlord, and if you're lucky, there will be a rental board a tribunal decision from the previous year, which will show you what the previous tenant was paying. Unusual to find that, or you can go on spec and subpoena the landlord's records. That is, you have to file the case, hoping that you're right. Then you have to get a subpoena form from the tribunal once there's a hearing, and send it to the landlord that he should bring the previous lease and his account books. And I've seen people win that way, but it requires some preparation. And even if people know that they have the right to do this, a lot of people don't do it.
No.
But
Yeah.
exacerbating the situation, I think, is the fact that this city is awash with condos, and people who are buying condos are renting for the first time. So there's no previous record. Like, they're renting out places and they're basically charging what they can. And there is no like in many cases there is no former tenant there to go back on.
Well, if there's no former tenant,
Right.
then there's no rent control for the first year.
Right.
So that's not abnormal.
No.
It's going from owner occupied to rental. Then it's a new unit on the market, and that's it.
So let me ask with respect to this 5.9, because that's really the number that jumps out this year,
Yeah.
right? It seems so high. You're right, interest rates have been going down. But then I heard landlords say, well, you know what, for the past 2, 3, 4 years before that, interest rates had gone up and the increases did not match. Is that a fair argument?
That's not untrue, but this is a really grossly excessive increase. The general principle of rent control in Quebec has been that they don't allow catch-up for previous years. If somebody doesn't, the only exception would be what they call a preferential rent. If somebody was the relative or the employee of a landlord, or if the building was owned, say, by some elderly lady for a long time and she mismanaged the property, and the heir takes over and finds, my God, this tenant is paying $300 and the market is $800, let's say. So in those cases, they can get the rent set to market, okay? But otherwise, to jump it like that, it's never been done like this. Maybe back in the 80s, and the reason it happened back in the 80s, it was the Reagan inflation, okay? When they decided they were going to jack the interest rate sky high all over the place. And I'm talking, in those days, you would see minimum increases for a year or so in the 10% range, and a lot of and 15% and 20%, and the landlord lobby was demanding 30%, which they didn't get. Okay, but that's the 80s, the early 80s. It never happened since.
So
How is this justified?
It's not. Okay, people are saying, how are these increases calculated? It's not the tribunal that does it. They are set by the minister based on the recommendations of some economic advisors. using various economic calculations. They use 3-year moving averages, for example. And when I look at all these numbers here, most of them are normal. Okay, look at electricity. Just as electricity, not as the entire rent. 2.9. Okay, maintenance. Okay, 6.9. All right. This is not the rent increase; it's just on the actual cost. Senior services and a senior's residence, 5.3. Okay, these are on the high side, but they're not insane. Okay, but and as I said, major repairs, $3.92 per thousand, high on the high side, but lower than it was last year. Indexation of net revenue, which is purely the indexing of the landlord's profits, 6.9, which turns into, in the extreme case, 5.9 on a self-heated building.
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowden Deli, serving Montrealers since 1946 and home of the city's best smoked meat sandwich, the Snowden Deli, DeCarry Boulevard, north of Queen Mary Road. All right, so I want to go through this for people listening who may find themselves in a situation like this where their rent is going to go up significantly by hundreds of dollars a month or over $1,000 over the course of a year. This is non-negotiable now. This is what has been set. This is what a landlord can now charge. What do you do if you're a tenant?
Well, first of all, don't assume that the landlord is going to send you a notice asking for 5.9%. He's going to send you a notice asking for 8%, 10%. The day before these rates came out, one 30-unit building, every single tenant got a notice for a $100 increase, which in their case was 14%, which we, of course, told them to refuse. Okay? So in some cases, the landlord has extra costs that justify a bigger increase than the base here. But in other cases, it's pure gouging, and a lot of people don't contest, and then they end up being taken to the cleaners. So the general principle is if it looks excessive, you send a registered letter to the landlord, or an email with proof of delivery, or a hand delivery with a receipt. Anything where you can prove a delivery, not regular mail, ever. Okay? I want to renew the lease. I refuse the increase. Send me the calculation to justify the costs. And the landlord's not compelled to send this calculation, but if they don't, it's a sign that they're not in good faith. Landlords who have got the bills to justify the costs will be glad to provide the calculation, especially this year. Okay? So one thing to bear in mind is if they're asking, say, for, 6.5%, 7% on a self-heated building, and you say, oh, no, that's too high, it shouldn't be more than 5.9. No, that's not necessarily true, because they might have a tax increase, they might have an insurance increase, they might have done major repairs. So there are things that add on, and that's why you want to see the calculation. They should show you that calculation in good faith, or it should be refused to make it go to and let it go to the tribunal. And in that case, the tribunal will not, they hardly ever do, but especially in those cases, they will not stick the tenant with the fees for the court case, which are somewhere around pushing $100 now. Okay.
So I want to stop you for one sec. If the landlord is not compelled to provide the breakdown of those costs, what's the next step?
Well, the tenant sends the refusal, like I told you, or just does not make a deal, and the landlord, within 1 month of the tenant's refusal, must, if he wants to get an increase, apply to the tribunal.
Okay.
And he has to send a copy of the application to the tenant within 45 days of filing, which in the old days, that's like more than a few years ago, they didn't have to do. Some of them waited until just before the hearing. That's not allowed anymore. If they miss that deadline, their case will be thrown out. Okay? There's all kinds of new technicalities that a lot of people, both landlords and tenants, do not understand that are now in the rules, that you got to be very careful about. So anybody files a case at the tribunal, whether it's the landlord, whether it's the tenant, for whatever reason, they must send a copy of the application to the tenant, and they must also send, or to the other party, and they must also send what they call a list of exhibits, which is basically a list of the things that you're going to be presenting in court, which can be requested by the other party on demand. What are exhibits? letters that were sent, pictures that were taken, videos, whatever. You know, you don't have to provide them when you send the list, but you have to inform the other party and the court that such a list exists.
Yeah,
So I'm just curious though, when you end up, if it goes that far, right now it's landlord tenant, you're at the tribunal, all the documentation that's necessary is there. What typically happens and how long a process is that?
It's fairly fast, unless they group the cases, right? So if you're in a high rise, and I don't know, you got 50 angry tenants who've refused it, and it goes to the tribunal, they're going to have to book a special room for that, and they're going to have to perhaps schedule a special hearing, and it's going to take a long time to process all the paperwork. So it could take a very long time to get a hearing. It could be a year later, and it could be, and the hearing could last a few hours, and then it'll be taken under advisement, and the judgment could come down a lot later. The record that I remember, the Rock Hill Apartments on Côte de Neige, years ago, a lot of tenants were disputing the rent increase. They got stacked up with 7 years of back rent increases. The case went, I believe, to the Supreme Court of Canada because they were affluent tenants with a good lawyer, and it dragged and dragged and dragged, and eventually 7 years later the judgment came down, and there was all this back money owing, and basically the landlord made a deal with the group, and they ended up paying less than they would have even if if the calculation had gone fully through the rental board at the time. There are all kinds of strange stories from the courts. Also, it's always possible that a party will mess up big time, not send a notice in time, not file at the tribunal in time within the month, not send the required proof of filing to the other party. And in that case, somebody can win a case
A technicality, yeah.
on a technicality, and happens more often than you would think. But should people approach this thinking, oh yes, I'm going to be saved by a technicality? No.
But one last thing I want to try to understand is you're the tenant in this particular case. You decide to contest the rent increase. You go through whatever you need to do in terms of times and notices and everything else. During that entire time, once you said you're going to contest an increase, are you still paying the old rent?
Yes, you are. The rent remains unchanged, and any conditions remain unchanged. For example, frequently, landlord wants to change the heating system and wants to make the tenant pay for heating instead of the landlord. And that should always be contested because the tribunal will set a fairly substantial rent reduction to compensate for the loss of the service. 20-25%, depending on what the situation is. So what some landlords will do is they'll say, I'm changing the heating system, you have to pay for the hydro from now on, and I'm not lowering your rent, or I'm giving you a very small rent increase. Don't be suckered on that. Okay, that's very important. Now, when the judgment comes down, the tenant will have to pay all the retroactivity, say 6 months at whatever it is, no interest, okay? Apart from that, here's what happens at the hearing. The landlord, apart from that calculation that he should voluntarily submit to the tenant, has to fill out another form for the tribunal called an RN form. And this has all the details, all the different repairs, major repairs that he did either on the individual unit or on the building as a whole, and other things that people can use to figure out what the tribunal is likely to grant. That RN must be submitted or he loses the case. The landlord must also present to the tribunal all of his bills and proofs of payment. Can't just say, oh, I spent $50,000 and not present anything showing he actually spent $50,000. Also, if he's paying some guy under the table and doesn't have a bill, that's not going to be accepted in court. Can't go in and say, oh, I paid Joe Blow off the street $10,000 to do something. The judge will laugh him out of court.
It's interesting, Arnold. Recourse, like for tenants, like the landlords are around when rent increases come, but I've been hearing stories like a situation in Lachine we're in a building where the landlord cannot be found. There was no hot, and it seemed like a nice building. No hot water, no heating or anything. The city had to come in and arrange for kind of emergency power in a situation like that, and they unable to find the landlord. And
It wouldn't surprise me in that particular case, and in ones like it, that the landlord will not even send a notice of increase, or may not, or will not show up at the hearing.
well, such is the case, in fact.
Yeah.
In this case.
Yeah, so there won't be an increase. Now, as far as this business with the city coming in and doing the work, that power has actually been with the city since the Drapo administration. Long time. I think it was only used once during the Drapo administration. When Dore got in, we were pushed really hard to get that power expanded, and it was. And it was expanded further during Tremblay. So the city can use it, when they have to. One example I remember, very similar. It was a building in NDG where the landlord and his wife were having a nasty divorce, and nobody paid the hydro on the building, so you had 30-odd tenants in there who were freezing all winter, and the city actually came in and restored the hydro. When they do that, this is a lien that they place on the property, so they can take it out. It's like an extra tax on the landlord, so the landlord can't get away with not paying it.
So people hearing this now, and I'm sure some tenants are going to find themselves in this very unenviable position right now, looking at these increases, and I'm glad you pointed it out, just because the tribunal has set this at 5.9%, as high as that may be, don't necessarily expect that's what your increase is going to be. It will be considerably higher more often than not.
I don't know if I'd say considerably higher, but you have to know a few things when you're prepping yourself for one of these. What type of heating do you have in your building? A lot of people don't know. Okay. Did the landlord have a tax increase? That's easy to check. You can contact the city or your local borough, and you compare the tax bills for the 2 years. Did the landlord do major repairs last year? Were those repairs only in the building as a whole? Were they in your apartment, or were they in another apartment which you are not responsible for at all? Landlords decides to do major renovations in other units. That does not go on the other tenants in the building, but a lot of landlords will try to get away with it. Okay, these are things people should know when they're refusing, when they're negotiating, when they're going to court.
With respect to the housing hotline, which you've been manning
Right.
for the last, 40 years, roughly?
We started doing a hotline as such, in the early, in 1980, and that wasn't even me. I was at that time working for two organizations, the NDG Community Council and the NDG Tenants Association, and we had two hotlines running, and I started doing something I'd never done before. I started doing, instead of the standard approach, which was put out a couple of press releases at increased time, I started doing radio talk shows and TV and everything all the time, constantly. And all of a sudden, instead of getting 10 calls a day, 20 calls a day, we were getting, in some cases, 100 calls a day on those lines.
And now what are you getting?
Oh, a lot less, because I'm not doing as much media as I used to, and we've only got the one line, and some days will be busy, maybe 20 calls will come in, whatever.
For people watching this now who have heard what you had to say, they are tenants, they're concerned with what's going to go on when they get this rent increase, can they just pick up a phone and call the housing hotline?
Yeah, after I get home from here. But it's the phone number, it's the same one we've had forever. It's 514-488-0412. 514-488-0412. We're generally open from 9 to 5. And back in the late 80s, I even wrote a rap about that. We used it when I was on Peter Anthony Holder's show. We played it all the time before I went on. Call up the hotline, that's all you got to do.
And it's still
And
there,
then
and you're still
488
going at it.
0412.
So,
Yeah.
all right, we're going to wrap it up. Arnold, I want to thank you so much for coming by
Oh, my pleasure.
and for letting folks know what's going on. Did you want to give the number one more time?
514-488-0412. 0412.
That is the Montreal Housing Hotline. That wraps up this edition of the Corner Booth Podcast from the Stoughton Deli. We'll see you again soon.